not a string per se. What type of HTML element was it? An input. So give me the rectangle that represents the input whose ID is name in that tree structure. Why? Because I then want to dive in deeper and get its value. So here's the object-oriented nature of JavaScript. The dot means go inside of this object, go inside of this object, and get some member function or member variable, data field. So document's an object. It has a method called getElementById. That method returns apparently an object, a rectangle that represents that node from the tree. And one of its properties, something inside of that rectangle, is apparently a property, a data field, data value, whatever you want to call it, an instance variable called value. That gives you the value that the user typed into that field. So what is the net effect, in layman's terms, of this line of code? To trigger an alert with what text? Hello, so-and-so, whatever your name actually is. So let's give this a try. Let's go back to the web page itself. Let me go ahead and type in Rob and click Submit. And there it is, hello, Rob. It's definitely a poor man's user interface in that we're just triggering this browser-dependent screen. Chrome even gives its own logo here. So there's other ways of doing this, but clearly we've dynamically gotten some data from that DOM element. But hopefully we can do a bit better. So let me actually roll back, not to 0, but to dom1.html. The form is going to be the same, but let's instead introduce a slightly different approach here. So in this version, what appears to be different at first glance, even if you can't read all of the lines in question? I moved the script. I moved the script down below. All right, why did I do that? Or what's the effect of this? There's a few things different here. Well, let's take a look. So one, it's an important detail that the form is now coming before the script. Because one of the conclusions we reached earlier is that JavaScript's reading of a page, or browser's parsing of a page is synchronous. It does things one at a time, at a time, at a time. So in fact, as a tangent, if you've ever used Google Analytics or you use like the Facebook like button, actually Google Analytics specifically tells you to put their code where? Sorry? At the end, right above the close body tag. Why? Well, just in case Google servers are slow or the user has a slow connection to Google but not to you, Google doesn't want to be responsible for slowing down the loading of your web page lest the user see nothing until Google also loads its JavaScript cookie tracking code at the bottom. Now, the last time I looked, Facebook tells you to put their code where? Okay, right after the open body tag, thereby giving it more priority. But in their defense, the way Google loads code into your page is they actually retroactively go back and inject it into the top of the page, so it's not actually a blocking call. So different subtleties that we'll not spend time on here, but that's the motivation for those different design decisions is how will the page's loading be affected. So let's see what the relevance here is. Here's my form. I've this time given it an ID of demo so that I can uniquely identify the form element itself. I have the same input and submit button as before. And then down here I have a script. But notice my code has changed a little bit. What's the first syntactic difference that you see this time that wasn't here before? Yeah?
Oh, well, return false is not after the ultimate like it was in the original one. It's below.
OK, good. So notice that return false is below the HTML itself. It's not inside of the HTML. In fact, there's no onSubmit attribute anymore. Instead, we seem to be manipulating a property called onSubmit. So again, to the object-oriented nature of JavaScript, it turns out that just as there's this global document object, inside of which is a method called getElementById, that in turn is going to return the element whose ID is demo. And which element is that? What type of element? It's a form. It turns out that form elements have a property called onSubmit. And this is not a property whose value is supposed to be a number or a string. It's supposed to be a function pointer, so to speak, a reference to a function, the address of a function. Think of it however you'd like based on what language you have as a background. So onSubmit equals, what does this mean? Notice that on the right-hand side here, there's the keyword function again, open paren, close paren. But what is absent this time from the function declaration? There's no name of this function. But it doesn't matter, right? Because what I'm actually doing here is clearly creating what seems to be an anonymous function. It's a function with no name, otherwise known as a lambda function. And when you call the function keyword in this way, Notice I have the open curly brace, then some stuff, then close curly brace, semicolon. So I've declared in these few lines of code an anonymous function, but because I have an equal sign right before it, I'm essentially storing the address of that function, a pointer there too, or a reference to that function where? As the value of this onSubmit property. The browser has been defined, meanwhile, to know if this onSubmit property, previously null, is set to a valid reference of a function when the form is actually submitted by the user by clicking submit or hitting enter on a physical keyboard. Find this value, call that function, and return true or false based on what it tells you to do. So clearly it's returning false. What else is it doing? It's also doing the alert, but the alert thing is the same as before. So what have we done? We've removed the onSubmit attribute from the HTML, replaced it instead with pure JavaScript code. Why? What's an argument in favor of this approach? Yeah?
Well, for some reason, if the browser doesn't like JavaScript, or if the JavaScript breaks, the form itself is not going to crash your browser.
OK, good. So just in case we're using a browser that has some incompatibilities, by moving the code outside of the context of the form, the script is more likely to be ignored. And indeed, that should be the case. Even browsers that have JavaScript off should just ignore the contents of this tag. So it's not a bad thought. In reality, I don't think it would end up being a problem, because if the browser just doesn't support JavaScript, the fact that we had onSubmit equals quote unquote something should also be ignored in the same way. But not a bad approach. Yeah?
Similar to MVC approach, we abstract a model from the view.
Good. So we'll come back to the jargon of MVC probably in a week or two. But for now, let's summarize it as my code was getting a little sloppy. Not only did I have HTML and then also some CSS in that file up above in previous examples, now I'm putting actual logic, programming code inside of my markup language, whose name suggests it should be for markup, making things bold, making things centered, structuring a page. Should have nothing to do fundamentally with code. So in the interests of keeping my coding life separate from my markup life, this is generally a better approach. It's not perfect, because frankly, it's like half a foot away from where it was before. So we haven't really solved this problem. But keeping code separate from logic and presentation is a key theme that we'll come back to, because it permeates the iOS SDK and the environment for writing iPhone apps. But this is at least a step toward that. And also, if we're only calling this function onSubmit, we definitely don't need to give it a name. If I'm the only person ever calling this code, I called it greet before, but I didn't even really need that name, because clearly I can do without it entirely.
What's the difference between single quote and double quote?
Good question. In JavaScript, none. I'm in the habit lately of using all single quotes for JavaScript and all double quotes for HTML, but there's functionally no difference in JavaScript. He's referring to the single quotes I had around demo, for instance. This would be a matter of style, too. For the projects, if you have a religion about single and double quoting, that's fine. Just be self-consistent with respect to your own code. All right, so now let me go into this file. And let's see, I'll use the simplest of programs on Mac OS, text edit. And I'm going to go into, remember, John Harvard's sites folder, which is where we put this code. I'm going to go into source 0, go into JavaScript, and go into dom1.html. So here's that web page, but now it's in an editable program. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to do things the opposite. I'm going to delete the script tag, and I'm going to put it above the form. And then I'm going to save the file. I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to reload the page. So indeed, the browser now sees the change I made in TextEdit. I'm going to go back to the page itself and reload this. So the form has been reloaded on the page. And now I'm going to go ahead and type in Rob again and submit. And it seems to have broken. In fact, I see a question mark in the URL, which usually means a form has physically been submitted to a server, which I did not intend. There was supposed to be a return false. So let me start diagnosing things. So when doing the first project in the course, much as Apple likes Safari, using Chrome is probably the better browser to use from a development perspective, because it has additional features, one of which is this inspector element at the bottom, which Safari has its own variant of. But I think you'll find that Chrome is useful both for mobile and desktop development. And I'm going to go into the console window here for a moment. And that's interesting. The red text, which if I zoom in, says uncaught type error, cannot set property on submit of null. So that's kind of a mouthful. I didn't really understand the first half. But onSubmit looks familiar, and null sounds worrisome. So let's see where in my code I use the keyword onSubmit. So here's my code. OnSubmit can't call this with respect to null. So again, the error was cannot set property onSubmit of null. So what does this suggest is null? The no demo. Specifically, the return value of the method getElementById when passed an argument of quote-unquote demo is apparently now returning not a rectangle, but null. And null is the null object. It has no property.